The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Lincoln High School as families began arriving for what should have been one of the most joyful days of the year. Cars filled every available space. Parents clutched cameras and flowers, and the air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. It was graduation day, and after months of preparation, the ceremony was finally here. Inside the school's main auditorium, rows of folding chairs stretched from the stage to the back wall. The graduating class of 2019 had worked hard for this moment, and their families had traveled from near and far to witness this milestone. Red and gold banners hung from the ceiling, and the school's marching band was setting up their instruments near the stage. Everything seemed perfect for what was meant to be a celebration of achievement and new beginnings. Marcus Rodriguez arrived early that morning, his pressed uniform crisp and his badge polished to a shine. As one of the school's 2 security guards, he had overseen dozens of graduation ceremonies over his 8 years at Lincoln High. He knew the routine by heart: arrive early, check the perimeter, ensure all exits were clear, and maintain a watchful but unobtrusive presence throughout the event. Marcus took pride in his work, believing that his job was to protect the students and families who trusted the school with their safety. His partner, Officer Jenkins, met him at the main entrance. Jenkins was newer to the position, having joined the security team just 18 months earlier after retiring from the city police force. Where Marcus was methodical and calm, Jenkins tended to be more rigid in his interpretation of rules and procedures. The 2 men had developed a working relationship, though they didn't always see eye to eye on how to handle various situations that arose during their shifts. The auditorium began filling up around 10 in the morning, 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Families claimed their seats, grandparents were helped to comfortable spots with good views, and younger siblings ran around in their Sunday best while parents tried to keep them calm. The graduates themselves were sequestered in the gymnasium, putting on their caps and gowns and practicing their procession one final time. Among the arriving families was the Hernandez clan, a large and close-knit group that had driven 3 hours from a small farming community to watch Maria Hernandez become the first person in their family to graduate from high school. Maria's father, Diego, had worked double shifts at the processing plant for months to save money for this day. He wanted to give his daughter a graduation gift she would never forget, something that would show her how proud he was of her accomplishment. Diego had served his country with honor as a Navy SEAL for 12 years before an injury forced him into early retirement. He rarely spoke about his military service, preferring to focus on his family and his work. But his brotherhood with his fellow SEALs remained strong, and when he put out word that his daughter was graduating, 5 of his former teammates made plans to attend the ceremony. They wanted to honor not just Maria's achievement, but also Diego's sacrifice and dedication as both a father and a veteran. The 5 SEALs arrived together just after 11 o'clock, their presence immediately noticeable even though they wore civilian clothes. Years of military training had given them a bearing and awareness that set them apart from the other parents and family members. They moved with purpose and confidence, scanning their surroundings automatically while maintaining relaxed expressions. To most observers, they simply looked like a group of friends supporting one of their own. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan led the group. He had served alongside Diego on multiple deployments and considered him one of the finest soldiers he had ever known. With him were Petty Officers Mike Chun, Carlos Ruiz, Tommy Park, and David Walsh. Each man had his own successful post-military career, but they never forgot the bonds forged during their years of service together. When Diego reached out about Maria's graduation, there was never any question that they would be there. The auditorium continued to fill, and by 11:30, nearly every seat was occupied. The ceremony wasn't due to start for another 30 minutes, but families wanted to ensure they had good spots to photograph and cheer for their graduates. The atmosphere was festive and warm, with conversations and laughter echoing throughout the large space. Marcus Rodriguez made his regular rounds, checking that fire exits remained clear and keeping an eye out for any potential problems. He had learned over the years that graduation ceremonies, while generally peaceful events, could sometimes become complicated when emotions ran high and large groups of people gathered in confined spaces. His goal was always prevention rather than reaction, addressing small issues before they could become larger problems. As he walked through the auditorium, Marcus noticed the group of 6 men sitting together near the middle section. Something about them caught his attention, though he couldn't immediately identify what it was. They seemed alert and observant in a way that reminded him of his own training, and they carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from experience in high-pressure situations. Marcus made a mental note to keep them in his peripheral vision, not because they seemed threatening, but because they clearly weren't typical family members. Officer Jenkins was stationed near the main entrance, greeting families as they arrived and directing them toward available seating. He had been briefed about the day's procedures and was focused on ensuring that everything ran according to the schedule provided by the school administration. Jenkins took rules and regulations seriously, believing that structure and order were essential to maintaining safety and preventing chaos. At 11:45, the school's principal, Mrs. Elizabeth Carson, took the stage to test the microphone and review her notes one final time. She had been leading graduation ceremonies at Lincoln High for over a decade and knew how important this day was for the students and their families. Mrs. Carson believed in celebrating achievement while maintaining the dignity and solemnity appropriate to such an important milestone. The graduating students began their final preparations in the gymnasium, adjusting their caps and gowns and forming the processional line that would carry them into the auditorium. Maria Hernandez stood near the middle of the group, her hands shaking slightly with nervous excitement. She had worked incredibly hard to reach this moment, balancing her studies with a part-time job to help support her family's finances. Maria's academic achievements were impressive by any standard. She had maintained a 3.8 grade point average while taking advanced placement courses in mathematics and science. Her goal was to attend community college for 2 years before transferring to a 4-year university to study engineering. The scholarship she had earned would cover most of her expenses, but she knew the road ahead would still require tremendous dedication and hard work. In the auditorium, Diego Hernandez sat with his wife and 3 younger children, his chest swelling with pride as he thought about his daughter's accomplishments. He remembered the long nights when Maria had stayed up studying at the kitchen table, determined to excel despite the challenges their family faced. Diego had always told his children that education was the key to opportunities he had never had, and Maria had taken that message to heart. The 5 SEALs sitting with Diego shared in his pride and excitement. They had heard countless stories about Maria over the years, and they understood how much this moment meant to their friend and brother-in-arms. Each of them had children of their own, and they knew the special joy that came from watching a child achieve something significant through their own hard work and determination. As noon approached, the energy in the auditorium reached a crescendo. Parents checked their cameras one final time, grandparents dabbed at their eyes with tissues, and younger siblings were given final warnings about sitting still during the ceremony. The moment everyone had been waiting for was about to begin, and the sense of anticipation was almost tangible. Mrs. Carson returned to the stage and asked for everyone's attention. The crowd gradually quieted as she prepared to begin the formal proceedings. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, the school's audio technician made final adjustments to ensure that every word would be heard clearly throughout the space. The band members raised their instruments, ready to play the processional music that would herald the entrance of the graduating class. Marcus Rodriguez took his position near the side wall, where he could observe the entire auditorium while remaining unobtrusive. He had learned that the best security presence was often an invisible one, allowing families to focus on celebrating their children without feeling watched or monitored. His radio was clipped to his belt, ready for communication with Officer Jenkins if any situation required coordination between them. Jenkins remained near the main entrance, though his attention was increasingly drawn to the group of men sitting with the Hernandez family. Something about their demeanor made him uncomfortable, though he struggled to articulate exactly what was bothering him. They seemed too alert, too aware of their surroundings, and their synchronized movements suggested a level of training or coordination that seemed out of place at a high school graduation. The gymnasium doors opened, and the first graduates began their slow, measured walk toward the auditorium. Each student had practiced this moment multiple times, but The reality of walking in front of hundreds of family members and friends added weight and significance to every step. The band began playing Pomp and Circumstance, and parents throughout the auditorium rose to their feet to catch their first glimpse of their graduating children. Maria Hernandez appeared in the doorway, her cap slightly askew and her gown flowing behind her as she walked in careful synchronization with her classmates. Diego's eyes immediately found his daughter, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. Beside him, his wife reached for his hand while their younger children stood on their chairs to see better. The five seals stood as well, their faces reflecting the pride and joy they felt for their friend's family. The processional continued for several minutes as all 112 members of the graduating class filed into the auditorium and took their seats in the front rows. The ceremony was officially beginning, and everything seemed to be proceeding exactly as planned. Principal Carson approached the podium, ready to deliver her opening remarks and begin the formal presentation of diplomas. But even as the ceremony got underway, tensions were building that would soon transform this celebration into something far more dramatic and challenging than anyone could have anticipated. Principal Carson's voice carried clearly through the auditorium as she began her opening remarks, welcoming the families and friends who had gathered to celebrate the class of 2019. Her words were carefully chosen to acknowledge the hard work and dedication that had brought each student to this moment, while also recognizing the support and sacrifice of the families who had helped make their success possible. The audience listened respectfully, though many parents were more focused on catching photographs of their children in their caps and gowns. Today we celebrate not just academic achievement, Mrs. Carson continued, but the character, perseverance, and promise that each of these young people represents. They are prepared to take their next steps into adulthood, carrying with them the values and knowledge they have gained during their time at Lincoln High School. In the front rows, the graduates sat with the mixture of excitement and nervousness that characterized such momentous occasions. Some fidgeted with their tassels, others whispered quietly to friends sitting nearby, and a few sat in solemn contemplation of what this day meant for their futures. Maria Hernandez sat still and attentive, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to her principal's words. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment and the dreams she carried for what lay ahead. Behind her in the audience, Diego Hernandez watched his daughter with intense pride. The sight of Maria in her graduation gown, sitting with her classmates and preparing to receive her diploma, represented the fulfillment of dreams he had carried since the day she was born. Diego had always believed that education would open doors for his children that had remained closed to him, and seeing Maria on the verge of graduation confirmed that his faith had been justified. The five seals sitting with Diego shared in his emotional response to the moment. Each of them understood the sacrifices that military families made, and they knew how hard Diego had worked to provide opportunities for his children while balancing the demands of his service to his country. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan found himself thinking about his own teenage daughter, who would graduate in 2 years, and he felt a deep appreciation for being included in this celebration of achievement and family love. Officer Jenkins continued to monitor the auditorium from his position near the main entrance, but his attention kept returning to the group of men sitting with the Hernandez family. Their bearing and alertness struck him as unusual, and he found himself wondering if they might pose some kind of security risk. Jenkins had been trained to identify potential threats, and while these men weren't exhibiting any overtly suspicious behavior, something about their presence made him uncomfortable. Marcus Rodriguez noticed his partner's focus on the SEAL team, and he made his way over to Jenkins during a lull in the ceremony. "What's got your attention over there?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the middle section of the auditorium. Jenkins pointed discreetly toward the 6 men. "That group sitting together. Something about them seems off. They're too alert, too coordinated. I think we should keep a close eye on them." Marcus studied the group for a moment, noting their posture and the way they seemed to automatically scan their surroundings. "They look like military to me," he said after a moment. "Probably family members or friends. I don't see anything threatening about them." But Jenkins wasn't convinced. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the group continued to bother him. He decided to move closer and observe them more carefully, positioning himself where he could watch their behavior and listen to their conversations. The ceremony continued with the presentation of various awards and honors. Students were recognized for academic excellence, community service, and special achievements in athletics and the arts. Each announcement was met with enthusiastic applause from the audience, and cameras flashed constantly as proud families documented every moment of the celebration. When Maria's name was called for the President's Award for Educational Excellence, Diego felt his heart swell with pride. His daughter walked confidently to the stage, shook hands with Mrs. Carson, and accepted her certificate with a grace and dignity that brought tears to her father's eyes. The five SEALs applauded enthusiastically, their appreciation for academic achievement reflecting the high value they placed on education and personal development. As Maria returned to her seat, Lieutenant Commander Sullivan leaned over to Diego. "You should be incredibly proud," he said quietly. "She's obviously got your determination and strength." Diego nodded, unable to speak for a moment as emotion overwhelmed him. "She's going to do things I never could have imagined," he finally managed. "This is just the beginning for her." Officer Jenkins had moved close enough to hear parts of their conversation, and the mention of determination and strength in a military context heightened his suspicions. He began to develop a theory that these men might be planning some kind of demonstration or disruption, perhaps related to military or political issues. Jenkins had seen news reports about veterans groups staging protests at public events, and he wondered if something similar might be planned for this graduation ceremony. The individual presentation of diplomas began, with students called alphabetically to walk across the stage and receive their certificates from Principal Carson. The process was methodical but filled with emotion, as each graduate's moment in the spotlight represented years of hard work and the achievement of a significant milestone. Family members cheered and called out names as their children crossed the stage, creating a constant buzz of celebration throughout the auditorium. When they reached the H section of the alphabet, Diego and his family prepared for Maria's moment. His wife checked her camera one final time. The younger children were reminded to watch carefully, and the five SEALs straightened in their seats in anticipation. This was the moment they had all come to witness, and everyone wanted to ensure that Maria felt the full weight of their support and pride. "Maria Elena Hernandez," Principal Carson announced, and Diego's daughter rose from her seat and began the walk that would carry her from high school student to graduate. She moved with confidence and poise, her eyes finding her family in the audience and lighting up with joy at their enthusiastic response. Diego stood and applauded, his face beaming with pride, while his wife wiped tears from her eyes. The five SEALs also rose to their feet, applauding with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for military ceremonies and special occasions. Their coordinated movement and the intensity of their response caught Officer Jenkins' attention, confirming his suspicion that this group was different from the typical family members attending the ceremony. He decided that action was needed to address what he perceived as a potential security issue. Jenkins approached his supervisor via radio. "We have a situation in the auditorium that requires attention," he reported. "There's a group of 6 men exhibiting coordinated behavior that suggests possible military training. They're showing unusual interest in the proceedings, and I think they may be planning some kind of demonstration." Marcus Rodriguez, hearing the radio communication, looked across the auditorium toward the group in question. He watched as Maria Hernandez shook hands with Principal Carson and accepted her diploma, while her family and friends celebrated enthusiastically. To Marcus, the scene looked like nothing more than a proud family sharing in a moment of achievement. But Jenkins had already made his decision. He began moving through the auditorium toward the group of SEALs, his hand resting on his radio as he prepared to address what he believed was a potential security threat. His training had taught him that prevention was always preferable to reaction, and he was determined to intervene before any situation could develop. The ceremony continued around him as Jenkins made his way through the rows of seated family members. Parents continued to cheer for their graduating children, cameras flashed, and the band played softly between each group of students. The atmosphere remained festive and celebratory, with no indication that anything was amiss. When Jenkins reached the row where the seals were sitting, he paused for a moment to observe their behavior more closely. The men were engaged in quiet conversation, occasionally pointing toward the stage where the diploma presentation was continuing. They seemed relaxed and happy, sharing in the celebration like any other family members in attendance. But Jenkins had convinced himself that their military bearing and coordinated behavior represented a threat that needed to be addressed. He approached Diego, who was sitting on the end of the row closest to the aisle. "Excuse me, sir," Jenkins said, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "I need to speak with you and your group about your intentions here today." Diego looked up in surprise, confused by the interruption during what should have been a purely celebratory moment. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" he asked. "We're here for my daughter's graduation. I've been observing your group, and your behavior suggests military training," Jenkins continued. "I need to know if you're planning any kind of demonstration or disruption of this ceremony." The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby family members, who turned to see what was happening. The 5 SEALs also looked up at Jenkins, their expressions shifting from celebration to confusion and, then, to concern as they realized they were being questioned in a security context. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan stood up slowly, his military training automatically assessing the situation and the potential for escalation. "Officer, I think there may be some misunderstanding here," he said calmly. "We're simply family friends attending a graduation ceremony." But Jenkins interpreted Sullivan's response as potential resistance to his authority. "Sir, I need all of you to come with me so we can discuss this situation outside the auditorium," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Your presence here is creating a security concern." The exchange was now attracting significant attention from other families in the surrounding area. Parents and grandparents turned to watch the confrontation, and the festive atmosphere began to shift as people sensed that something was wrong. Some families began whispering among themselves, trying to understand what was happening and whether it might affect the continuation of the ceremony. Diego felt a surge of anger and embarrassment at being singled out during his daughter's graduation. "This is my daughter's graduation day," he said firmly. "We have every right to be here, and we haven't done anything wrong." "That may be true," Jenkins replied, "but your group's behavior has raised security concerns that need to be addressed. I'm asking you to come with me voluntarily, but, if necessary, I'm prepared to require your removal from this event." The confrontation was escalating quickly, and Marcus Rodriguez realized that his partner was creating exactly the kind of disruption that security personnel were supposed to prevent. He began moving through the auditorium toward the situation, hoping to defuse the tension before it could affect the ceremony or create a genuine security problem. Meanwhile, the 5 SEALs were processing the situation through their military training and experience. They understood the importance of maintaining calm in tense situations, but they also recognized injustice when they saw it. Their friend and brother-in-arms was being humiliated in front of his family during one of the most important moments of his daughter's life, and their instinct was to protect and defend him. The stage of confrontation was set, with emotions running high and positions becoming increasingly rigid. What should have been a simple celebration of academic achievement was turning into something far more complex and challenging, with the potential to affect not just the families directly involved, but the entire graduation ceremony and all the families who had come to celebrate their children's accomplishments. The tension in the auditorium was becoming palpable as Officer Jenkins continued to insist that Diego Hernandez and his companions leave the ceremony. What had begun as a routine security concern in Jenkins' mind was rapidly escalating into a public confrontation that was drawing attention away from the graduation proceedings and creating exactly the kind of disruption that everyone wanted to avoid. "I'm going to ask you one more time to come with me voluntarily," Jenkins said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that suggested he was prepared to take more forceful action if his request was refused. "Your presence here has been flagged as a security concern, and I have the authority to remove anyone who might pose a threat to the safety of this event." Diego felt his face flush with anger and humiliation. Here he was, on what should have been one of the proudest days of his life, being treated like a criminal in front of hundreds of other families. His daughter had just walked across the stage to receive her diploma, achieving something that represented years of hard work and sacrificed by their entire family, and now he was being told that his presence was unwelcome. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Diego said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "I'm a veteran of the United States Navy. I served my country for 12 years, and these men served alongside me. We're here to celebrate my daughter's graduation, nothing more." The mention of military service seemed to harden Jenkins' resolve rather than soften it. In his mind, Diego's claim to veteran status actually supported his theory that this group might be planning some kind of demonstration or protest related to military issues. Jenkins had seen news reports about veterans groups staging disruptions at public events, and he believed his instincts about this situation were being validated. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan recognized that the situation was spiraling out of control and that Jenkins was not going to be reasoned with through normal conversation. His military training had taught him how to assess and de-escalate conflicts, but he could see that this security officer was operating from a position of fear and suspicion rather than rational analysis. "Officer, I understand your concern for security," Sullivan said, maintaining a calm and respectful tone despite his growing frustration. "But you're making a serious error in judgment here. We're simply family friends attending a graduation ceremony. There's nothing threatening about our presence, and forcing us to leave would be both inappropriate and unnecessary." But Jenkins interpreted Sullivan's calm demeanor and articulate response as evidence of leadership training that suggested these men were indeed organized in some way that might pose a threat. His training had taught him that sometimes the most dangerous individuals were those who appeared calm and reasonable while harboring hostile intentions. "Sir, I don't know what your intentions are," Jenkins replied, "but your group's behavior has raised red flags that I can't ignore. You're all clearly military trained. You're sitting together in a coordinated fashion, and you're paying unusual attention to the proceedings. I need you to come with me now so we can sort this out away from the other families." The confrontation was now attracting significant attention throughout the auditorium. Parents and grandparents in nearby rows had stopped watching the diploma presentation and were instead focusing on the argument taking place in their midst. Some families were becoming concerned about whether the situation might escalate into something dangerous, while others were simply curious about what was happening. Marcus Rodriguez reached the scene just as Jenkins was preparing to call for backup support. Marcus quickly assessed the situation and realized that his partner was creating exactly the kind of public disturbance that their job was meant to prevent. The families involved appeared to be ordinary graduation attendees, and there was no evidence of any actual threat or inappropriate behavior. "Jenkins, what's going on here?" Marcus asked quietly, hoping to defuse the situation before it could escalate further. "This group has been exhibiting suspicious behavior," Jenkins explained, his voice tense with conviction. "They're clearly military trained, and I believe they may be planning some kind of demonstration. I've asked them to come with me for questioning, and they're being resistant." Marcus looked at Diego and the 5 SEALs, noting their expressions of confusion, frustration, and growing anger. He could see that these were simply family members trying to enjoy a graduation ceremony, not security threats requiring intervention. "Officer Jenkins," Marcus said carefully, "I think you may be misreading this situation. These appear to be family members attending the ceremony like everyone else here." But Jenkins was now committed to his course of action and unwilling to back down. "I know what I've observed," he said firmly. "These men are coordinated and alert in a way that suggests training and potential planning. I'm not going to ignore a possible security threat just because they claim to be family members." The exchange was interrupted by a voice from the stage, where Principal Carson had noticed the commotion in the audience and was trying to determine whether the ceremony should continue or be paused while the situation was resolved. "Is everything all right in the audience?" Mrs. Carson asked into the microphone, her voice carrying throughout the auditorium and drawing even more attention to the confrontation. The question from the stage caused Jenkins to feel additional pressure to resolve the situation quickly. He believed that allowing the confrontation to continue would create an even greater disruption, and he decided that immediate action was necessary. "Sir, you and your group need to leave this auditorium immediately," Jenkins said to Diego, his voice now loud enough for families several rows away to hear clearly. "If you don't comply voluntarily, I'll have to call for additional security support to escort you out. Diego's wife, who had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, finally spoke up. What are you doing? She asked Jenkins, her voice breaking with emotion. This is our daughter's graduation day. We have every right to be here. Why are you doing this to our family? Her words seemed to break through some of the tension in the surrounding area, as other parents began to realize that this was a family being harassed during what should have been one of the most important days of their lives. Some people began to murmur their disapproval of Jenkins' actions, while others simply watched in uncomfortable silence. The five SEALs exchanged glances, communicating silently through looks and subtle gestures. They had remained seated throughout the confrontation, hoping that their calm demeanor would help de-escalate the situation. But it was becoming clear that Officer Jenkins was not going to be deterred from his course of action, and they were going to have to decide how to respond. Petty Officer Mike Chun, who had served with Diego on 3 deployments, slowly stood up. Officer, you're making a serious mistake here, he said quietly. Diego Hernandez is one of the finest men I've ever known, and he's earned the right to watch his daughter graduate. We're not going anywhere. The other 4 SEALs also rose to their feet, not in a threatening manner, but in a show of solidarity with their friend and teammate. Years of military service had created bonds between these men that went far deeper than ordinary friendship, and they were not going to abandon Diego during this moment of crisis. Jenkins saw the coordinated movement of the 5 men as confirmation of his worst fears. To his mind, their synchronized response proved that they were acting as an organized unit with potentially hostile intentions. He reached for his radio to call for backup support, believing that the situation was now beyond his ability to handle alone. All units, I need immediate backup in the main auditorium, Jenkins spoke into his radio. I have a situation with multiple subjects who are refusing to comply with security directives. The radio call sent a chill through the auditorium as parents realized that what they had assumed was a minor misunderstanding was being treated as a serious security incident. Some families began gathering their belongings, unsure whether they should leave the auditorium or remain in their seats. Others pulled their children closer, worried that the situation might become dangerous. Marcus Rodriguez knew that once additional security arrived, the confrontation would likely escalate beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. He made a decision to step between Jenkins and the Hernandez family, hoping to create some space for cooler heads to prevail. Jenkins, hold on a minute, Marcus said firmly. Before we call in more people, let's take a step back and think about what we're actually dealing with here. But Jenkins was now operating on adrenaline and conviction, unwilling to reconsider his assessment of the situation. These men are trained and coordinated, and they're refusing to comply with legitimate security directives, he insisted. This is exactly the kind of situation our training prepared us to handle. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan realized that rational discussion was no longer possible with Officer Jenkins, but he also understood that escalating the confrontation would only make things worse for everyone involved, especially Diego's family. He needed to find a way to demonstrate that they posed no threat while also standing firm against unjust treatment. Officer, you have our full cooperation, Sullivan said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. But we're not leaving this auditorium unless you can provide a legitimate reason for our removal. We're here as invited guests of a graduating student, and we've done nothing to justify being treated as security threats. The standoff was now complete, with both sides committed to their positions and unwilling to back down. Jenkins was convinced that he was dealing with a potential security threat that required immediate action, while the SEALs were determined to protect their friend's right to attend his daughter's graduation ceremony. The situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding into a conflict that would require intervention from outside parties to resolve. As additional security personnel began responding to Jenkins' call for backup, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone's judgment, character, and commitment to doing what was right in a difficult situation. The sound of additional security personnel entering the auditorium created a ripple of anxiety throughout the crowd. Families who had come to celebrate their children's achievements suddenly found themselves in the middle of what appeared to be a serious security incident. Parents instinctively moved closer to their children, while grandparents looked around uncertainly, unsure whether they should remain seated or seek safer positions. Two additional security officers and a police supervisor entered through the main doors, responding to Officer Jenkins' call for backup. They moved quickly but carefully through the aisles, trying to assess the situation while avoiding any actions that might escalate tensions further. The presence of law enforcement at what was supposed to be a celebration added a surreal quality to the proceedings. Principal Carson, still standing at the podium on the stage, found herself in an impossible position. She had a responsibility to ensure the safety of everyone in the auditorium, but she also needed to consider whether continuing the ceremony would be appropriate given the disruption taking place in the audience. The graduating students, still seated in the front rows, were turning in their seats to see what was happening behind them. Maria Hernandez, who had just moments earlier been basking in the pride of receiving her diploma, now watched in horror as her father and his friends were confronted by security officers. The joy and excitement she had felt was rapidly being replaced by confusion, embarrassment, and a growing sense of injustice. This was supposed to be her day, the culmination of years of hard work, and it was being destroyed by what seemed to be a terrible misunderstanding. The police supervisor, Sergeant Williams, approached the situation with the caution and experience that came from 20 years of law enforcement. He could see immediately that the confrontation involved two distinctly different groups with very different perspectives on what was happening. His priority was to de-escalate the situation and gather accurate information before taking any action. "What do we have here?" Sergeant Williams asked Marcus Rodriguez, recognizing him from previous interactions at school events. "Officer Jenkins believes this group poses a security threat," Marcus explained, gesturing toward Diego and the 5 SEALs. "He wants them removed from the ceremony. But I've been observing the situation, and I believe they're simply family members attending the graduation." Sergeant Williams looked at the group in question, noting their calm but determined demeanor. Years of experience had taught him how to distinguish between actual threats and misunderstandings, and his initial assessment suggested that this situation fell into the latter category. "Officers Jenkins," Williams said, "can you explain specifically what behaviors you've observed that led to your security concerns?" Jenkins, feeling the pressure of having to justify his actions to a supervisor, launched into his explanation. "These 6 men are clearly military trained. They've been sitting together in a coordinated fashion, paying unusual attention to the proceedings and moving in synchronized patterns. When I approached them about their presence, they became resistant and refused to cooperate with security directives." Sergeant Williams listened carefully, then turned to Diego Hernandez. "Sir, can you explain your connection to this event and why you're here today?" Diego, struggling to maintain his composure in the face of what he considered an outrageous injustice, answered carefully. "My daughter Maria just graduated. She's sitting right there in the front row. I'm a Navy veteran, and these men served with me. They came to support my family on this important day. We've done nothing wrong, and we don't understand why we're being treated this way." The mention of Navy service caught Sergeant Williams' attention. As a veteran himself, he understood the bonds that existed between military personnel and the importance they placed on supporting each other during significant life events. His assessment of the situation began to shift as he realized he was likely dealing with a case of mistaken assumptions rather than an actual security threat. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, recognizing that Sergeant Williams seemed more reasonable than Officer Jenkins, decided to provide additional context. "Sergeant, I'm Jake Sullivan. I served with Diego for several tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. When he told us his daughter was graduating as the first in their family to finish high school, we wanted to be here to support him. We're all veterans, and we understand how these kinds of milestones matter to military families." Williams nodded, his understanding of the situation becoming clearer. He had attended similar events for his fellow veterans and knew that the military community often rallied around important family moments. The behavior that Officer Jenkins had interpreted as threatening was more likely the natural bearing and alertness that came from years of military training. "Officer Jenkins," Williams said carefully, "I think we may have a misunderstanding here. These gentlemen appear to be family friends attending a graduation ceremony. I don't see evidence of any security threat or inappropriate behavior." But Jenkins was now too committed to his position to back down gracefully. "Sergeant, with respect, I know what I've observed. These men are coordinated and organized in a way that suggests planning. I believe they may be intending to stage some kind of demonstration or disruption. The exchange between the security officers was being watched intently by hundreds of family members throughout the auditorium. Many parents were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the way the situation was being handled, particularly as it became clear that the confrontation involved a veteran and his family during their daughter's graduation ceremony. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly grandmother sitting 2 rows behind the Hernandez family, finally spoke up. "This is absolutely disgraceful," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "This man's daughter just graduated, and you're treating him like a criminal. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Her words seemed to break a dam of frustrated sentiment that had been building throughout the auditorium. Other family members began voicing their disapproval of the way the situation was being handled. "Let them enjoy their daughter's graduation in peace," called out another parent. "This is supposed to be a celebration, not an interrogation," added someone from the back of the auditorium. The growing chorus of disapproval from the audience was creating additional pressure on the security personnel to resolve the situation quickly and appropriately. Sergeant Williams realized that continuing the confrontation would likely create an even greater disruption and potentially turn the entire graduation ceremony into a public relations disaster for the school. Principal Carson, who had been watching the developments from the stage, decided that intervention was necessary to protect both the integrity of the ceremony and the welfare of the families involved. She stepped to the microphone and addressed the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief pause in our ceremony to resolve a misunderstanding," she announced. "I ask for your patience while we work this out so that we can continue celebrating our graduates." The principal's announcement seemed to crystallize the absurdity of the situation for many people in the audience. Here was a graduation ceremony, one of the most positive and celebratory events in the school calendar, being interrupted by what appeared to be a case of security overzealousness run amok. Diego's wife, who had been struggling to hold back tears of frustration and embarrassment, finally broke down. "Please," she said to Sergeant Williams, her voice breaking. "This is our daughter's graduation day. We've worked so hard for this moment. Why are you doing this to our family?" Her emotional plea seemed to affect everyone within hearing range, including some of the security personnel. Marcus Rodriguez, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with his partner's actions, decided to speak up more forcefully. "Sergeant Williams, I've been watching this family and their friends throughout the entire ceremony," Marcus said. "They've been model attendees. They applauded at appropriate times, they took pictures when their daughter received her diploma, and they've shown nothing but respect for the proceedings. Officer Jenkins is mistaken about their intentions." The 6 SEALs had remained standing throughout the confrontation, not in a threatening posture, but in a show of solidarity that demonstrated their unwillingness to abandon their friend during his time of need. Their calm but determined presence was beginning to influence other families in the auditorium, who were starting to see them as the victims of an unjust situation rather than as potential threats. Sergeant Williams made a decision. His experience and training told him that these men posed no threat to anyone in the auditorium, and continuing to treat them as security risks would only create greater problems for everyone involved. More importantly, his sense of justice was offended by the idea of disrupting a military family's graduation celebration based on unfounded suspicions. "Officer Jenkins, I'm overruling your assessment," Williams said firmly. "These gentlemen are going to remain in the auditorium to enjoy the graduation ceremony. There's no credible evidence of any security threat, and removing them would be inappropriate and potentially discriminatory." Jenkins looked stunned by his supervisor's decision. "Sergeant, I strongly disagree with this assessment. I believe we're making a serious error that could compromise the safety of everyone here." "Your concerns are noted, Officer Jenkins," Williams replied. "But this situation is resolved. These families are going to remain and enjoy the ceremony, and we're going to return to our normal security positions." The tension that had been building throughout the confrontation seemed to deflate suddenly, as Sergeant Williams' decision became clear. Diego felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with lingering anger about having been put through such an ordeal during what should have been a purely joyful occasion. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan extended his hand to Sergeant Williams. "Thank you, Sergeant. We appreciate your professionalism and your understanding of the situation." Williams shook Sullivan's hand, then turned to address Diego directly. "Mr. Hernandez, I apologize for the disruption to your family's special day. Congratulations on your daughter's graduation. You should be very proud." As word spread throughout the auditorium that the confrontation had been resolved, a spontaneous round of applause began among the families who had been watching the situation unfold. The applause started with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly grandmother who had first spoken up in support of the Hernandez family, and quickly spread throughout the auditorium as other families joined in showing their approval of the resolution. The applause grew stronger and more sustained as people realized they were not just celebrating the end of an uncomfortable confrontation, but also showing support for a veteran and his family who had been unjustly treated during their moment of celebration. The sound echoed throughout the auditorium, creating a powerful moment of community solidarity. Diego looked around at the hundreds of families who were applauding, many of them standing to show their support. Tears came to his eyes as he realized that what had started as a humiliating ordeal had transformed into an overwhelming demonstration of community support for his family. The 5 SEALs beside him were also moved by the response, understanding that the applause was recognition not just of their friend's situation, but of the service and sacrifice of all military families. Principal Carson, recognizing the emotional power of the moment, decided to acknowledge what had happened rather than simply moving forward as if nothing had occurred. She stepped to the microphone as the applause began to fade. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have just witnessed demonstrates some of the finest qualities of our community," she said. "We have seen the importance of standing up for what is right, the value of supporting our neighbors during difficult moments, and the respect we owe to those who have served our country. Mr. Hernandez, your daughter should be proud not only of her academic achievements, but also of the father she has and the community that supports your family." The principal's words triggered another round of applause, even more sustained than the first. Diego stood and acknowledged the support with a wave, his face showing both gratitude and emotion. Beside him, the 5 SEALs also stood, recognizing that they were being honored not just as individuals, but as representatives of all military personnel who serve their country and support each other. As the applause finally died down, Principal Carson prepared to resume the graduation ceremony. The remaining students still needed to receive their diplomas, and the celebration of academic achievement that had been interrupted needed to continue. But the tone of the ceremony had been fundamentally changed by what had occurred. The confrontation and its resolution had transformed the graduation from a routine academic ceremony into something deeper and more meaningful. The families in attendance had been reminded of the importance of standing up for justice, supporting their neighbors, and recognizing the service of military personnel. The graduates themselves had witnessed a powerful lesson about courage, community, and the importance of doing what is right even when it requires taking a stand. Maria Hernandez, still sitting with her fellow graduates in the front row, felt a complex mix of emotions about what had happened. She was grateful that her father had been vindicated and that the community had rallied to support their family. At the same time, she was amazed by the courage and loyalty shown by her father's military friends, who had been willing to risk their own comfort and safety to stand by their teammate during his moment of need. As the ceremony resumed, there was a sense of renewed purpose and meaning to the proceedings. The remaining graduates received their diplomas with enthusiastic support from an audience that had been reminded of the importance of education, perseverance, and community solidarity. The celebration continued, but it was now enriched by the understanding that graduation day had become about much more than academic achievement alone. The story of what happened that day would be retold many times in the weeks and months that followed, becoming part of the school's history and a source of pride for everyone who had been present. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons are learned not in classrooms, but in moments when ordinary people are called upon to demonstrate courage, integrity, and support for their fellow community members.